All right, shall we charge into the 2010s?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I thought I don't know. Did you want to start like did you want to dive in right away? Because I thought that maybe it might be sensible to talk about how do you even go about reviewing a decade like that? Because I've never done anything like that before. Like, obviously, I mean, I'm not that old. Like, how can I review decades? I'm only
Mm.
30. But when I just started thinking of it, I started thinking of events like points in time, and for some reason, all I could think of initially was the Fukushima incident, even though it's probably not that important. But anyway,
Well,
but then you can go and then you can say, well, no, it's not about the events. Like maybe like some assassination of somebody could be like an important event, but it's more about like processes or whatever. But
well,
I
yeah, I
thought
think
that
it's just an attempt to sum up a period of time, right? So it's sort of arbitrary. There's no right way to do it. One thing I was going to say about the 2010s compared to the previous decade is that they didn't have a lot of big historical events. They had big historical processes, but they didn't have these, really self-contained events that, that define things like the
9/11.
yeah, like 9/11, the Iraq
mm,
War, even the financial crash of 2007, 2008, these well-defined events. The 2010s were pretty quiet in a way. They didn't have those major events, although they had a few. It was more of the way I thought about it was acceleration, like big trends that existed before, but were sort of ignored because they weren't that important, suddenly accelerated, or they had effects that people didn't predict. Well, I think both the Great Replacement and the social media revolution. I think those two things were the biggest events of the decade, but they were processes and they didn't even start in the decade. They started long before, or well,
what
in the
was
case
the
of
first?
social media.
What was the first one?
The Great Replacement.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's a big process, right?
Yeah,
But
sure.
but people didn't really pay that much attention to it. It was a minor issue for most people until the middle, well, maybe the early part of the 2010s when people really started to feel it and feel that it was going wrong.
Hmm.
And then the 2010s were really a decade of social media and all the effects of that, right? And a general fragmentation of the culture. So there were big changes in the culture. At least I think so. I mean, that's what I have observed. Like if you look at media today, mass media today, it's very different from the beginning of the decade when there was at least a pretense of objectivity. There was a pretense of we're going to tell you the truth, we're going to cover both sides, and we're going to bring people together. By the end of the decade, it's taking sides, and there's this big cultural conflict.
Do you
Um,
think this has something to do with just smartphones in general? Like that everybody has a camera and that there is no like
that's part of
everything
it too. Yeah.
is filmed, like every incident is potentially public.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The smartphone is another thing that defined the decade. So let me just give my list of big,
Yeah,
processes or things or whatever, and then you guys can give yours or add to the list.
yeah.
So yeah, the Great Replacement, social media, the smartphone, and then also sexuality breaking down. Like this didn't start in the 2010s, but it's something that seems to have accelerated. The sort of male female conflict seems to have accelerated. The rise of China, the ongoing decline of the West, and a kind of, and this, the last thing is related to everything. It's a sort of a combination of illusionment and disillusionment. People immersing themselves in fantasy, but also uh, the fantasies are not very satisfying, and they don't last very long. So people becoming, well, I guess I've described it as immanentizing the abyss. People losing faith in everything, feeling lost, confused, then retreating into illusions, but the illusions don't work that well. They're not an adequate substitute for reality. So I think those were the big processes or changes that I saw. And then one of the biggest non-events was the lack of a financial crisis, the relative stability of the financial system. And I had another one, but I can't remember what it was. I think it was maybe just the absence of any major war. So I guess those are my bullet points. What do you guys have?
Well, you basically named everything, but yeah, I don't know. I thought, like, with regard to free speech, like this idea that free speech was under attack, and I don't know if that's true, but I thought that, like, the social media part, if you extend that to Patreon and all of these means of, making a living on the internet, and I thought that maybe people were more willing to go the independent route.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably a small portion, like it's not that important, but
well, that's related to social media, right? That's
yeah.
But you're right. The free speech
and to the mass media, I think, because you can have these independent guys who.
Yeah, but basically the idea that I had was that it only was necessary to attack free speech because of all these independent figures that were able to speak their mind, so to speak, and be
right.
independent of the mainstream and still make money and still be able to make a living, and then you had to crack down on them.
Yeah, no. And actually, that's a really good point. That one of the themes of the decade was divergence. So you get an amplification of things on both sides. You get it like the Great Wokening, this huge increase in social justice, which I forgot to mention. But then you also have the rise of right-wing reaction, or you get an increase in the amount of, we have a huge increase in the amount of speech, right, in the amount of free speech. Like there was a literal huge increase in the freedom of information because of social media.
And then as a response, the comeback of like the hate speech laws and blasphemy laws and
right. Also and then as a reaction, yeah. That's what, as a reaction to that, then you got all that reaction against that increase in the freedom of information. So let's let I want to hear Gilmour's points because he had a list and.
I put up a list, and on the politics side, I put at the top the rise of populism, and I guess this is of course Trump and Brexit and all the populist parties in Europe. So this is part of the Great Divergence, I guess, of opinions. So on the one side, and I put further down intersectional feminism or feminism. So that's the one side, the Great Awakening, and then the populism side. And then I have the MRA, MGTOW, alt-right, incel stuff, which is also kind of part of the pole that goes towards populism. So that's basically the same point that you had, of course. And related to this is this thing with globalism and the reactionary response to globalism. I think these are part of the same axis, right? But on a world political scale instead of on the cultural political scale, I guess.
So what is the new divide? If you can divide things into two camps, which is how it usually works out, what is the left-right divide now?
I think the left-right divide is state or state-related bureaucrats versus the broadly productive rural or smaller city population. That's a civil war within the host populations of the West, right? And then they recruit people to their side, and of course the bureaucrat class has been more successful in recruiting outside forces to their cause, of course. But there has also
what do you mean by outside forces?
Support from groups that are not part of the civil war, really. They're just like paid soldiers, basically. So they are like migrant groups.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Also, like Antifa, right? They are not really part of the establishment, but they are kind of the useful idiots, or.
Well, I think Antifa are actually part of the establishment because they are, by and large, like.
They're white, upper middle class.
Yeah, exactly.
Are they really upper middle class? Because I think that Antifa is basically it's when you don't have anything to do, like you don't have a job, you don't have anything to look forward to, like in terms of your own life, and you want to feel like you're bringing about this revolution or whatever, or you're bringing down the system. It's like LARPing. It's what I think.
It's young guys, but I think they are largely kids of the middle class or the upper middle class, right?
Yeah, that might be true. Yeah, but
this is another thing. Although, I mean, I agree with you that the underlying motivation for all the political games is this sort of boredom.
Yeah.
There's the word for that.
Ennui?
Yeah, I was thinking ennui, but there might be another word as well that describes it better. I mean, it's not ressentiment. There's another probably French word for it, but yeah, it's like they're bored and they're LARPing. And so this was also a decade of LARPing. Like it was a decade of illusions, fantasies, cosplaying, just people turning away from reality, but then taking the illusions out into the streets. You know, is this really? I don't know. It's a strange. It's like become very difficult to describe anything now. You know, the old categories have sort of fallen away.
I think also the last one I had on this list was leftist or globalist entryism of all institutions, and that, to your point of acceleration, try and describe the world like in the early 90s, that you're going to say that like the Catholic Church is a radical leftist institution in the year 2020, and people would just think that's beyond ridiculous. They wouldn't. It's so how quick that has moved is. I mean, when you're in it, maybe you don't think about it so much. But I think even me and Meat, we have grown up like viewing the church as very conservative and stuffy when we were young.
Yeah.
Yeah. The shift, the big shift to the left in the establishment. Yeah, it's something that happened in that decade, and it is kind of hard to really understand. Like the extreme left-wing rhetoric in mass media is a little bit hard to understand.
Right.
I mean, I think I can understand it, and I think it has something to do with the freedom of information, sort of forcing people to diverge. Because like we talked about this with respect to music, right? Like in the past, there were a fairly small number of distribution channels for any kind of information, and so all information was filtered by elites. But also, culture was a very small stream. You know, like people could know most of popular culture. People knew the popular movies, music. They knew what was on the news, right? There was one narrative because everybody was hearing it. And it started to change in the 90s, even before the internet. But with social media, everybody became a distributor of information, right? Like with the internet, everybody's a producer. Before with mass media, everybody's consuming information through TV, radio, newspapers, etc. Then with the internet, everybody can produce information, but you can't get it out to an audience. So there was still that bottleneck of mass media. But in the 2010s, the monopoly on that, on the distribution of information was broken by social media, and that had a big effect on the culture. And I think it forced the mass media to sort of take sides in order to keep an audience, right?
Right. They had to double down kind of on the on the mainstream like humanism type of
Yeah.
ideology, right?
Well, I just want to say I don't think that's all of it, but I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Gilmour, what you think you?
Well, but I'm not sure if that's like because the logic of the media today is different. It's just that they are part of the old logic, the old guard. In the social media era, even now, it's like very concentrated towards the largest channels like PewDiePie or Kim Kardashian or whoever. It's a huge domination of the really big voices still, even if there's like there's a large long tail, but the long tail is really small, and there's a
Well,
few content creators who are extremely big.
yeah, but the thing is, you can get information from small content creators, and also PewDiePie didn't have to go through a gatekeeper. He didn't have to go through an elite bottleneck to get out there.
Well, I was just thinking, sorry, but I was just thinking that what you said that resonated with me, that in the 2010s, like with all of this, well, it's almost like mass alternative media, right? Like just that it became viable to be a part of a group online, of any group, like be it MGTOW or alt-right or furries or some polyamory or whatever. Like you were able to branch out and become part of some underground or some alternative community, let's call it. But and the establishment was stuck with their old ways, and so they kind of doubled down on we are the purveyors of truth or whatever. But it's just I don't know, I'm all over the place, but just another point with regard to PewDiePie. Yeah, sure, he might be the biggest one, but that doesn't mean that somebody who watches PewDiePie only watches PewDiePie. He can watch PewDiePie, and he can also watch whatever Nick Fuentes, and he can also be part of the internet blood sports or something. So I think that it's a kind of this fragmentation that takes place on the internet, and that and basically all of these small little groups and medium-sized groups and whatever tiny groups and larger groups and PewDiePie, all of those are in opposition to the mainstream, to the old established media, and that is, I think, kind of the dynamic that is going on.
Yeah, I guess the big question mark is if will they have real political impact.
Oh no, I don't think they will, but I think that is just what kind of describes the 2010s.
I think they do have real political impact. I don't think they have it in the way that like Sargon thinks by that he can just jump from YouTube to like playing electoral politics. But the Trump election was highly determined by social media, and even what the media report on now is highly determined by social media.
Yeah, that's true.
So it wasn't Russian bots, it was just the internet as a whole?
I think things have changed, like in a lot of different ways. So first of all, we're not adapted to information abundance. We've never had anything like this before. Like one of the changes that I've noticed over the last 10 years is that everybody now is in their own little bubble. And me too. Like, I'm not moralizing about this. People are walking around with headphones on. They are looking at their phones. They are, consuming what they specifically select for their consumption. They don't know what the person next to them is watching or listening to or believes. So they're forming their views of the world in these bubbles that are, very cut off from those around them and connected to people on the other side of the world, right? and this, I'm not saying this is a bad thing or a good thing, but this is changing culture. And the biggest change that I see is this fragmentation. Maybe the Great Divergence is a good word for it. That now that information flows freely and people can associate freely. Like we have a new kind of free association, which is that we have been liberated from the geographic constraints on association.
Right. Yeah. That is what I was kind of trying to say, and I think that in opposition to that is the establishment media that is still trying to kind of bring everybody under their umbrella to get them away from this, these fragmentary groups that they want to associate with, and to say, no, you listen to us, guys.
Yeah. Well, what they're doing is they're doing what people typically do. They are blaming human agency for something that is a historical process, right? So they think that the bad, what they view as the bad stuff, is due to a few people doing this bad stuff. They don't understand that the way information flows has fundamentally changed, and that's why all this stuff is happening. That it's not like these bad people must be stamped out kind of thing. That's not going to work. It might have an effect on certain ideas or people if you heavily censor them, but it's not gonna bring back the good old days when there was one narrative, and it was controlled by the mass media.
Yeah.
But I would.
No, go ahead.
Well, I just want to ask you guys if you think the state media has shifted significantly to the left in the last 10 years.
I can answer that because I really I didn't even give a shit up until like 2017 or something.
Well, okay. Gilmour, what do you've been paying attention probably, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can't say that I watch like the state media every night, but my distinct impression is that it has always been left wing, but it has shifted. It was earlier, it was vaguely left wing. Now it is, in some aspects at least, distinctly, proudly left wing, and so that's a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to have shifted. I mean, during this divergence, everything has gotten more extreme, but the establishment ideology seems to have shifted much more toward this, what would have been considered far left ideology back.
But it's mainly on the cultural axis, right? Because I remember. You mean
not economic?
Yeah, not economic. Like 20 years ago or so, they made the same look at this person who don't get benefits from the state. That kind of reportage was very common even 20 years ago, or probably 40 years ago too. So that's always been there, and that's unchanged. What's changed is mainly on the issue of immigration, I guess, or on the issue of lobbying for certain interest groups within the state apparatus.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to say. You're right, because it shifted from a focus on economic issues to a focus on these issues of identity. Right. It shifted over to identity as the main focus of left-wing politics, and to these like vague notions of oppression by the mere existence of feelings and other people kind of thing. So how did that happen? Is that how do you think that happened? Do you think that happened just because it was happening in the academy and then all these students came out with this new ideology? Did it happen because as sort of a reaction against the failure of humanism? To some extent, is this an increase in the religiosity of belief as a response to its empirical invalidation? I'm trying to figure out.
The last few years are probably have an element of doubling down on the convictions which were met with cognitive dissonance when it smashed with the world, mainly, I think, at least here in Europe, mainly, I think, around the migrant crisis. But before that, I think there was a kind of gradual process happening, which I think is related to urbanization and the divergence of people living in big cities with the rural people. There is a cognitive and cultural and psychological divergence there, which is significant. And so that's why I think the journalists, the worldview of journalists is radically different, because they are radically different people to common people today. And that wasn't the case as much 50 or 60 years ago, I think.
Yeah, there's probably more specialization in that way, like that they are all of the same background, they all went to the same, they took the same courses, and they don't just hire journalists off the street now to go out and do that kind of tough guy reporting that they used to do.
There's also this, I noticed this obsession with accreditation among journalists. So they have this, it's a kind of guild aspect to it. So if you are not educated at the right institutions, you're not a real journalist. Even if you do journalism, even if you go out on the street and talk to people or whatever, do research on stuff and report it, you're not a real journalist so long as you haven't the correct accreditation. And this is, I think this is an analogous development to the one in the academy, right?
Yeah.
Where if you don't do the science TM stuff, if you don't publish in the correct papers, and if you don't have a PhD and so on, you cannot possibly be an authority on a subject just because you have read a lot of it and know the stuff. You have to have the correct certification, right?
Yeah, I think maybe part of that is that there's the increasing amount of cognitive dissonance, the increasing amount of chaos and confusion that people are facing and trying to make sense of the world makes them turn back to these things like authorities and conformity and moralism as sources of certainty, right? So they're facing all this uncertainty when they look at the world, when they try to make sense of it. And then they go online and they say something that they think is smart, and they instantly get savagely debunked or mocked or whatever.
Right.
If you're a big journalist at the New York Times and you say something, and suddenly 25 frogs who know more about the subject than you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You can't win. You can't win against the internet autists, so you have to fall back on your credentials, right?
And it all comes down to it all comes back to the internet and to this idea. I was thinking, for some reason, this idea of this long march through the institutions, I think that's what it's called, right? This Frankfurt School shit, and came to mind they whatever their idea was, we're gonna conquer the minds of the people through the institutions, but they didn't think about the internet, and the small guy didn't have a voice. So let's say let's just for the sake of the argument say that this long march through the institutions, this is was like a real plan, right? And so so they conquered the institutions, they put out all the right, left-wing, whatever, books and ideas, and they formed the opinions, and then suddenly the internet comes around, and now the small guy has a voice and can get his shit out there, maybe even more effectively than they can, because who's gonna read their academic stuff, right? Nobody's gonna read their paper or whatever. And suddenly they're faced with this problem that now somebody who's never been to university can gather a following and can debunk all of their stuff for free online, and that's what they're faced with now. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Krugman and his silly. The other thing is now they are exposing their stupidity because they're not filtered either, right? Like they used to be filtered by their editors and all this stuff, and they'd go on a talk show and they would be very careful about what they said and it would be very carefully edited. And now they're on Twitter saying whatever comes to mind and they're exposed as complete idiots. So that's the other part of it.
Yeah.
Like that Krugman tweet the other day was hilarious.
I didn't really get it. Like what he like.
Well,
what was that?
I don't know. He's a Nobel Prize winner, right? But he can't.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think he just got. Yeah, he's a famous economist, but somehow he got scammed by. I assume he got scammed.
So he got scared and he decided that it was better to just make a statement beforehand, even though probably nothing would have.
No, I don't know what he thought.
Either he was looking at shit, illicit stuff, or he got scammed and he thought that maybe it was gonna come out that he was looking at stuff.
Yeah, but you can't be you can't be that clueless if you are really into like whatever child CP or whatever. You can't be that clueless that you're gonna get scared and then tweet about it or.
No, I'm pretty sure I am pretty sure that Krugman, for all his flaws, is not into that. I think he's just
probably just a boomer.
Yeah, just being a boomer. But it is just an example, right? Where these cults of the sort of idea of academic infallibility, like the faith that people used to have in the experts, including the technocrats, right? Not just politicians, but academics, bureaucrats, the serious people, all that stuff. That's really taken a beating, partly because they can be debunked. Anything they say can be torn to shreds, partly because they themselves can't resist the impulse to be human and stupid. And partly because reality is not falling into line. So it's those three things that are causing the breakdown of faith in the technocracy or the establishment. And yet it's still going strong. So that's the depressing thing, right? That it just keeps doubling down and doing what it's doing, and it doesn't seem to. It seems pretty much oblivious to reality at this point.
Well, they're in power still in the institutions and stuff like that. So of course they're not going to give it up. They're not going to say, "Okay, guys, you are right. We are full of shit." Like obviously not. Obviously they're going to hold on as fast as they can, or like as hard as they can to this power or this influence that they still got.
Well, you might have hoped for a course correction, though. And I think in the past you might have gotten a course correction just because there was more of a unified culture. So they would be more responsive to feedback because they had to, there had to be a unified narrative.
Yeah.
Like the media really had to present a unified narrative. And so if that narrative was diverging very much from reality or very much from the general opinion, they would have to course correct.
Well, yeah, but I don't think the course correction only happens like by generational shifts, I think, properly. So
yeah, I guess if it's deep enough, yeah, that's the thing. If there's a paradigm that has to shift, then yeah.
I think maybe something like that has happened in the UK now, because like they moved out all the like Remainer Tories, and they only have the Leave Tories left in the party, and so it's been kind of a generational shift in politics there. And I don't know how deep the shift is, but there's been a kind of break with the old, because before they tried like moving the needle a little bit by electing a former Remainer PM like Theresa May, and she was trying to implement like the opposite of what she really wanted, and that didn't work out. And now they have like made a generational shift. But in most countries, I mean, for Trump, for example, for the Trump presidency, the guys under him, they're the same guys that were
Yeah.
there. So
Well, the Trump thing.
largely, but yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole Trump thing was one of the biggest stories of the decade, and it was a story of triumph and failure. You know, the triumph of his election and the complete failure of his administration to actually do anything.
Yeah, it has failed, but on the other hand, if his message can keep winning, if it wins the next time, or if some other guy comes after him with a message that has been inspired by his message, maybe they can get in more people who align with those views rather than like rely on the old ones who just know the systems and will work in the old vein, right?
Well, it's like, I think the thing that happened is historical processes accelerated. You know, the information revolution accelerated very rapidly. And also the flow of people around the world accelerated very rapidly. And I don't think our political processes can keep up with that level of change. Like I just don't think we have enough time to wait for another generation or another political cycle to solve these problems.
Yeah, that's it. If you had infinite time, then yeah, whatever, fine. Even though within the academy, or I don't see how a generational shift does anything, because you are getting indoctrinated by these, let's say, leftist professors, and you become a leftist, and you go on to become a leftist professor. You keep teaching, right? Like it's for me, it's harder to see how in the academy a shift can happen. Or
yeah, no, it will probably not happen like that.
Yeah.
You have schisms. That's the only way it happens.
In politics, okay, I can see that, like, the new generation is just fed up with the old, with the boomers or whatever, and then they say, we're gonna go the other way. But like something like an institution like the university, it's harder to see. But even still, it doesn't matter now what sphere you're in. You don't have infinite amount of time, and so you don't have the luxury of just waiting generation after generation until they come to their senses.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think the way that a change in the academy or in the broader cultural sphere happens is from politics. Like Viktor Orban, he has done stuff to the universities in Hungary.
Oh, he just cut their grants or something. And,
cut the grants
sure.
to the university stuff and so on. So that's the way you're gonna have to do it in some kind of way. Maybe not as like iron fisted as he has done it, but in some, I don't know, in some kind of way.
Yeah, but the iron fist is just taking away the free Gibbs, you know.
Yeah, I think he did some. I don't know the details of this, so I shouldn't say, but I think he actually banned like the Soros
gender studies and shit.
No, Soros Open University.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I can see, but yeah, there has to be some influence from the outside to crack open something like the academy. Like it does. I don't think it changes by itself, like just through a generational shift.
And another thing that happened in that decade was the breakdown or the increasing, I guess, divergence between men and women. Like that's part of the Great Divergence. The decline. I mean, there was a decline in fertility, but that had already been pretty low for a long time. But there was a decline in sex. You know, this irony that in the age of Tinder and all this stuff, there was a big increase in the amount of celibacy, especially for young men. And we saw the gay and trans cult, I don't know what to call it, this worship of sexual deviance. Meanwhile, we saw the breakdown of not just the family, but heterosexuality. I don't know. Maybe I'm seeing stuff filtered through my own bubble, but it does seem like there has been a feminization
Well,
going on.
are you saying that men can get sex from women so they turn bisexual or gay or trans and
No, I'm saying, well, no. I think the breakdown of sexuality was happening anyway, for reasons I've talked about before, right? Like the Industrial Revolution,
yeah,
sexual
yeah,
revolution.
but that is not a product of the 2010s, right?
No, no,
Like,
no, no, but
yeah,
it accelerated, and
okay,
this is the time when it was really felt. Like
okay,
the first time people talked about things like incels in public, or like the rise of the manosphere was kind of a new thing, and that happened starting around 2010.
yeah.
That and it started out with the PUAs, but it ended with the MGTOWs.
Oh,
You know,
right. When
it
did
follows that.
PUA start? Do you know? Does anybody know?
I think the
I mean,
late noughties.
the game, the book, the game is
Yeah.
that's probably from like '04 or something, I think.
Mm.
Okay.
Well,
So that's
I mean,
like,
the idea of it goes way back, but
yeah.
what happened was there were a bunch of bloggers, pickup artist bloggers and manosphere bloggers and stuff like that. Like a lot of the big people now in the sort of dissident right space were bloggers in the early 2010s or late noughties. And what happened was their ideas circulated, but among a very small number of people because blogging didn't have a good distribution channel, right? And then on Twitter, some of these things started to propagate, and then they got onto YouTube, and that rapidly increased the scope of it. YouTube had this early period when things propagated really well on YouTube. So I think the manosphere.
Man, it would be so interesting to see what if YouTube just stayed the way it was, like, without the shadow banning shit and without the, oh, you can see this, you can see that, you're gonna get recommended this stuff because that's in line with what we as a company, as some, Silicon Valley company think is appropriate. Like just an alternate universe where the internet is actually free, but there is like a YouTube.
Yeah, well, it would. I don't know. I don't know that it would necessarily produce an ideal outcome because people are still people, and the anarchy of information isn't necessarily rational. It's not necessarily more rational even than a filtered discourse space.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. But certainly in the early part of the decade, information was very free, right? And the internet was mostly unregulated, uncensored, and social media, as it became more and more widely used, was a distribution channel. And so all of a sudden, a lot of these things started to get into the zeitgeist. But I think also at the same time that was happening, there was this ongoing breakdown of male-female relationships due to the other factors, right? So
I mean, those things are they are just like effects of modernity, right? I think you agree with that. All these ideologies, or intersectional feminism and MRA and everything, they're like the surface level symptoms of modernity, because otherwise, I mean, they're like the effect of mixing modernity with Western civilization, late postmodern Western civilization.
True, but there's a lag in the culture. Like, in the 90s, the incentives for women were pretty much the same as they are today, but they had more of that romantic ideal of a relationship, a boyfriend, marriage, etc. Because it just takes a while for that to get eroded, It just takes a while for people to accept, because what happens is there's a feedback loop between the mass media and individual norms, and the mass media can't go way ahead of individual norms, right? So, yeah, my impression is that it accelerated, and I know that there are statistics on sex that sexlessness or celibacy increased. Like not having sex in the last year went up a lot in the 2010s, especially for guys.
Yeah, both for
So
girls and guys, but especially for guys.
yeah, and there wasn't some new thing that at least I don't think that was an effect of the information revolution per se. Like I don't think it was because of Tinder, but it could be.
So it
It could
would
be
be
like,
interesting to see because the fertility rate in South Korea is below 1. So
right.
I would guess
Well,
that it would be interesting to see the stats of sexlessness there, I suppose, because I would guess that they don't have this very loud political.
They have
I-
more of it than you might think, but I think Japan shows it happening earlier, right? That their lack of sex problem started back in the I think late 90s. But these things happen differently in different places for various reasons. But that was something that happened in something that accelerated in the 2010s, and I think that was reflected in culture, like in third wave feminism. Like a lot of third wave feminism and MGTOW are just reactions to not having a relationship.
I think an emblematic thing. I don't know if it was released in the 2010s, but 50 Shades of Grey is pretty emblematic of this.
Oh
like
yeah.
when the winner takes all sexual markets or whatever you want to call it, where the only I don't know the sexually viable man is a billionaire who rides helicopters or whatever that guy does.
And he still has to tie up the woman so
Yeah.
she can feel that he's powerful enough to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bizarre. But that's
I
a great.
remember.
Sorry, go ahead.
I remember actually Jordan Peterson had something about that like the 5 archetypes of like the perfect, the desirable sexual partner for a woman were like millionaire. Oh fuck! Of course I can't remember them, but one of them was pirate. Which was
Pirate.
Yeah, pirate.
But basically, I just wanted to jump in a couple minutes ago, so I guess I'll just say it now. So does it come down to just the availability of pornography then? Because 50 Shades of Grey is a kind of pornography for women, right? But obviously men, well, everybody knows what pornography for men is like. So just which again comes back to the internet, that like maybe in the aughts you didn't have these Pornhub, like all of these sites that just had any category that you want to watch and any like basically it fulfills all of your fantasies or something, and maybe that is why sex went back, like
I think that
was reduction. Yeah.
That might be part of it. I mean, it certainly was a decade of porn, a decade of fapping. I mean, both in that literal sense, but also in the other, like LARPing as a kind of, detachment from reality and a kind of masturbation. But yeah, it was it was the decade in which all these little communities were created for people to share their fetishes or their, their desires.
I mean, isn't porn probably? I'm just gonna guess, but it's probably more of like an anesthetic for the males who weren't gonna get much anyway.
Well, I don't know if that's true though, because like women, like sure you could pursue like a Tinder date, and then you'd have to go through all of the whatever, paying for the drinks and going physically going to the date in the first place, and then at the end of the day maybe you get lucky and you get to have sex with the girl, but maybe the sex sucks or something, but then you could just stay at home and whatever, have a 5-hour fab session with all sorts of visual input from whatever 50 different girls, and maybe that's just preferable.
I don't think that's the
to
bottleneck.
Casual sex.
But I don't think like fapping or like going out to dates. I don't think that's where the bottleneck is. The bottleneck is in the female choice, right? So
Well, yeah,
uh,
ultimately yes, but so I don't think we're blaming porn for the breakdown of sexuality in modernity, but it is just something that happened in the 2010s, right? This increased abundance, like it's now abundant, right? It's this
I think
thing that
it could probably have a very large effect on sex within a relationship, but I don't think it has that much of an effect on like the amount of sexless people.
well, I don't know. It might. I don't think it's the fundamental driving force, but it could in that it diverts you away from, like it diverts your attention away from reality. So it's part of this general thing where people immerse themselves in fantasy worlds, and the more you immerse yourself in a fantasy world, whether it's a video game or watching pornography or whatever, or reading 50 Shades of Grey.
On the subject of that, I think Instagram is probably more powerful than porn, actually.
Yeah. All of these things together. Yeah, it's not just the like explicit specific, porn. It's a more general thing of the more people are able to detach themselves from reality and plug into these artificial simulations of reality that fit them better and are easier and cheaper and stuff, the more they detach from reality. Like a guy 20, 30 years ago, let's say, if he wanted to see a girl, he could go into this embarrassing process of buying a magazine, or he could just go outside and walk around and go to the beach or somewhere like that, right? So at least he was being attracted toward the real stimulus.
Yeah.
But now the easiest thing before you even get started, right, is to be attracted toward an artificial stimulus, and it's very easy for people to become addicted to those things. Yeah. I agree with you. I think that the main thing is the breakdown is female choice and the breakdown of that of female emotions in the modern environment, but you can't completely dismiss this other big thing, which is this abundance of fake everything.
Absolutely.
Right? Like fake societies, fake communities, fake waifus or whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right, and Instagram and whatever, Twitch streamers, and that's just soft pornography.
That's a fascinating thing, the Twitch girls.
Yeah, that's just like you pretend like you have some sort of relationship with them, like you log on, they're talking, like they're not fucking on stream, obviously. They're just talking about their day. And you can be in the chat,
before, right?
Yeah, and you can be like, oh yeah, hi, whatever. How was your day? Here's $5, and then she answers, oh, thank you. She reads your name and says, my day was great, and then you feel like she addressed you or something. Like it's like a It's more of like a relationship simulator, I guess, more than just the hardcore sex part of something like Pornhub or something like that. But it's the same basic idea.
Yeah, Gilmour, what were you saying, that the Japanese had something like that?
Yeah, they have like cafes where you pay a woman to listen to just talk to you. They have something like
Oh, right. No, you're right. The Japanese had that going way back in a way. Yeah. Like even the geishas were like that.
Yeah.
But, God, men are pathetic. Pay money just have a girl listen to them for a little while. Yeah, it's pretty sad. But that is an interesting thing too. The Twitch streamers, and on the topic of PewDiePie, he will, jokingly talk about people like Val Delphine, right? So it's not just that PewDiePie might be, there's only a few big people, but he propagates other, he's a channel through which other people are distributed, or their works get out there and stuff like that, right?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, probably everybody's every streamer's or every YouTuber's dream is to be mentioned by somebody like PewDiePie, because that just means, wow, suddenly I have 1,000 new viewers or subscribers or whatever.
Right. Well, I'm just saying that,
It's
like,
basically the same thing. He's also like a simulated friend.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's the same. Yeah, of course. And that's also and I do watch these things. Like, for example, Red Letter Media. These guys who watch movies and review movies or just talk shit about movies or get drunk watching bad movies. You after, like, I've been watching them for, I don't know what's, like, 8 years. I don't know how many years, but probably for a better part of the decade. Like, it feels like you know them at some point.
Yeah, people are substituting online stuff for a lot of real life things. You know, friendships, relationships, all that stuff. I wish we had Kudzu here, because, like, I didn't grow up in this world, right? Getting the perspective of somebody who grew up fully immersed in this stuff, because he grew up entirely in the 2010s, you know.
Yeah,
like,
we are kind of dinosaurs, because we still had to, like, memorize phone numbers when we were little. Yeah.
We remember what it was like before. Like, I remember, you know, when you wanted to hang out with your friends, you had to physically go to Denny's. If you wanted to have a philosophical discussion, you went to hang out with your philosophical friends that you made in real life and had a coffee or smoke or whatever, went to a bar or something.
But see, in this regard, I think the internet is a plus, because what am I gonna like walk around Wolfsburg trying to find like some philosophically inclined guy to have a discussion with in a bar? No, I don't want to do that. I want to go on the internet and have, like, you know, whatever, 10 people to choose from or whatever.
It's a real detriment to, like, IRL social cohesion, because you can always find smarter, more interesting, more informed people to talk to online than you can, like, in real life.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a bad thing. I like a lot of things about the information revolution, but it is what it is. It's a big transformation in, not really in human nature, but in the way that human nature, well, it's a big transformation in the environment that we're putting human nature in. But yeah, I don't know. We should probably not beat this topic to death, because but it is the big thing, right? It is a really big thing.
It is, yes. Yeah. Anything that ultimately, like, for me at least, like, almost any topic I can think of, like, with modernity, with this, not with modernity, but, like, with the last, well, we're talking about the last decade, right? Everything comes down to the internet and the availability of information and the positive and negative effects that has.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's shift. We can always come back to that topic, but let's shift to the economy. And
oh yeah, that is a good point for me to take a break and yeah and let you guys talk.
Okay, well, I'm thinking mostly Gilmour is going to take this one. There was no Peter Schiff was very disappointed. It was a bad decade for Peter Schiff, right? What happened to our catastrophic financial collapse?
Yeah, he would have predicted, like, hyperinflation and big stock market crashes and who knows what else. And nothing of that. I mean, kind of the absolute opposite happened, I guess. So a big thing, and this is not only in the last decades, but profit margins have gone up a lot for companies, especially in the US or in North America, because and that has to do, like, with the shift, of course, because a lot of the companies now are software companies, and software companies have a lot of higher margins. They don't need to employ so much tangible capital, like physical things in the real world, buy up to use. They just, like, make this program, and it's replicable in eternity.
Is this all an illusion, though? I mean, is this all just paper wealth as opposed to any real wealth being generated?
Um, well, well, to the extent that the software can make people more productive, it's real wealth, of course. But maybe they take those profits from other sectors. But it's also of course they don't need as much labor, and the labor unions and so on have got significantly weakened in the last few decades, and I mean now they're basically a non-entity for the most part.
But so where does the excess profit go? Like, what does it go into?
How
is it consumed? Like, what is it spent on?
They go on the balance sheets of the very large companies. So Google, Apple, Microsoft, every one of those guys have huge cash coffer. I mean, I think Apple has at least 100 billion in cash in that they put in treasury bonds, and then they do very large stock buybacks. So they buy their own stock over their market, and then they of course do dividends too. So some of that comes out to the investors.
But doesn't that mean a lot of it is just an illusion, because it's not actually being spent on anything? So it's not really productivity. It's just financial.
Well, there will be if you buy back your stock, you cut down on the amount of unit which will share in the wealth of the company. So there will be all else equal an increase of the stock price. So there will be a wealth effect, right? Because even if you don't sell that stock, if you own it, you can borrow against it, and you can feel that you have more opportunity to consume because you're richer on paper, at least, if you sell the stock.
Has real consumption gone up in any way? It doesn't seem to me that it has, right?
The issue with this, of course, is that the top 10% or even the top 1% own the absolute majority of all the wealth in the stock market. So, and I mean, they can only consume so much. So that's the issue. That's been the issue with this quantitative easing program, which the Fed has been doing, is that the trickling down has not happened, because usually you would assume that the trickling down would happen with as profits go up, the workers in the companies will see that, or will see the opportunity to bargain for higher wages, right? So it would be shared with the workers, and the capitalists would, at least to some extent, share the liquidity that's pumped into the system. But that's not what has happened, because, and this is also, of course, the trend that you import cheap labor. I mean, the Amazon warehouse workers or whoever. And also, of course, that a lot of the big companies are software companies, and they don't really need that much labor. And some of that, of course, they import, like Indian programmers and so on. You would know more about that subject than me, I guess.
There's been a huge amount of that. I don't know how much. I don't know how much money has actually been saved by it, but it's a trend.
But so the levers are kind of have gone off kilter a bit, so that there hasn't been a trickling down of, and so that's why they just keep doing the quantitative. They still do it now. They still buy up these treasury bonds.
I've stopped paying attention to this stuff, but did the Fed reverse it? Because I thought they were actually...
It tried tightening, right? If you remember, last fall in 2018, they were signaling that they were going to start unwinding the Fed balance sheet. With the Fed balance sheet is like treasury bonds that they own, right? That they have bought since the financial crisis. So they were signaling that they were going to unwind the balance sheet. And they
did sell a bunch, right? They sold.
They did start doing that, was called quantitative tightening. And what happened was when they started doing that, the markets fell off a cliff, right? They were also at the same time signaling that maybe interest rates were going to go up a bit. And so they reversed course pretty quickly on that after a couple of months. And after that, like in 2019, I think the S&P 500 was up 30% last year.
Yeah.
Of course, a huge year. The median return is somewhere between 8 and 10%.
Well, you're laughing, but
yeah, I was well positioned for it. Yeah, but that was not because I had any big foresight into like what the broader market was going to do. It's just I always own stocks.
Right. No. Yeah, I know you're the value investing, following the value investing strategies, which means you're going to take ups and downs, but you're trying to do better on both the ups and the downs, generally speaking, right?
Right. Yeah. But maybe we should move from the stock market focus a bit. I don't know.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah, it's sort of abstract now, and people have lost interest in it, but it is something, at the beginning of the decade, it was this big thing. Everybody was talking about the financial system, and now people have sort of forgotten about it.
Yeah, and so there's been a huge asset prices have moved up a lot, and a lot of that has got to do like with central bank policy, and real estate has gone up a lot, but also other physical assets like timberland and
probably farmland and certainly
farmland as well. Yes,
any mineral assets, any natural resource thing would be going up too.
And also like wind farms, for example, has been a huge thing now in Europe.
Oh,
right?
Interesting. Well, okay, so I'll just give you my impression, which is not technical at all. It looks like Japan. It looks like a sort of managed decline, a sort of a permanently dysfunctional economy that has inflated asset prices but does not have a catastrophic collapse. It just sort of goes on, but this is another divergence, I guess, the divergence between the financial system and the real economy. It's almost like there's no connection there now.
For Europe, that's really true, because in Europe there's no growth now. The only growth that happens is because of demographic growth, and that's just because of immigration, of course.
Mm-hmm. And that's also sort of fake, because it's like it shows up in GDP, but it's not really a net positive, certainly for the people who were there before. It's more of a shuffling around of things.
Because people don't understand per capita, so they think there's still growth in it. But in the US, there's still some growth, and there's apparently wage growth has picked up a bit now. So maybe it will become better in the US. Of course, without China. If China doesn't keep growing, nobody else can do it, basically. From this
really?
point. So, and China, there's been talk a long time that China will be slowing down, but it hasn't happened yet. And nobody outside of China really understands how the Chinese economic system works, because so much of it is state directed, and they build these huge cities before they move in any people there. And there's talk about lots of Chinese owning like 3-4 apartments just on speculation that the price will go up and so on, but never seems to happen. And these ghost cities have been around for at least 10 years, I think, now at this point. And I don't know, nothing seems to happen with it.
All models seem kind of incapable of even explaining what is going on, let alone predicting what's going to happen. Yeah. But my model that I have been using is not perfect, and I expected more. I expected some kind of financial crisis in the last 10 years, so my model is not perfect. But it's just Japan. Like, I'm just going off we're the lagged version of Japan. That's the best I can come up with, and they have this long kind of lost, generation of. Forgetting about the financial economy, the real economy, like the real quality of life in Japan was kind of stuck or slightly declining for a very long time. especially for young people. They couldn't afford houses. They had these crappy jobs they could do with no chance of getting ahead. That was a big part of that kind of, you know.
And you anchor that mainly on the demographic issue in Japan, I guess, because they were earlier with the demographic.
No, no, it was based on their bubble and bursts, and then their response to it, that they just printed money. And so I think the indefinite money printing approach, it doesn't seem to produce another huge crash unless it produces another big bubble. It seems to just produce an endless kind of stasis almost.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what happened in Japan, and I don't really understand it, honestly. I mean, the whole negative interest rate thing seems insane to me, but it had the effect that it had, and we could observe it. So I was just being purely empirical, right? Like,
yeah.
I expected something.
I don't know. I think that bubble was so outstandingly huge, the 80s bubble among the real estate bubble in Japan. So I think measuring like from the top of the bubble there and saying, well, nothing went anywhere for 30 years is a bit misleading. It's like measuring from the top of the IT bubble in.
Well, I'm not thinking about stock prices. I'm thinking about the quality of life of people in the economy. That the Japanese industrialized rapidly after the war. They attained a pretty high standard of living pretty quickly. They never quite got to the American standard of living, but they got pretty close. And then they stalled. And they've been stalled ever since. So never mind what happens in the financial system. The real economy is dysfunctional in a lot of ways. It does produce jobs, but they're not, for most people, they're not great jobs. And it doesn't really produce houses, although it's getting better now because they've had low or even negative population growth. It actually is getting better for young people in Japan. Like I know young people in Japan, or not young, but young families in Japan, and how they're getting along and stuff. But they had this long period when it was just like it was going nowhere. So there wasn't much hope, right? Like if you got a career, what were you looking at? You were looking at this life of commutes, work, and you live in a little box, and that's it.
You can kind of see. I mean, the real estate thing is kind of screwed up everywhere, but in like on the West Coast in the US, they have this talk about like living in the pods and all that. It's kind of an analogous thing to the Japan situation for the young people in Japan.
Yeah, San Francisco and Vancouver are very similar. That there is just no hope of ever owning a house in those cities. So if you can never own a house, and you can't even afford to live in an apartment bigger than like one bedroom or whatever, or you have to commute an hour each way or something like that. It's
crazy. It's this crazy setup of the economic system where like the middle class or the masses of people who have employment and so on, they can't afford to like have a family formation and have kids and so on, because they have to finance it all themselves. And so it's only the poor people and the very rich people who can afford to have children. So it's crazy. It's a crazy setup.
Like I'm maybe being a little ecological about it also, and thinking of it as sort of like a climax forest. Like you have a forest fire and then things grow up, but then eventually the trees get locked together in a competition for light, and then it's done, and then it's very difficult for new trees to grow up. And you can see the economies of Japan and in a lot of places in Europe after the war as sort of having been leveled and then growing up again. And I think also in the New World, it was more like this, on a much bigger scale, filling in of an ecosystem with a new invasive type of economy, right?
So because they reinflated like the asset prices with this with the central bank policies, and so there was no clearing of like old companies, clearing of real estate prices, and clearing out of like unproductive workers, so that they could be
right. Yeah. The
with
collapse.
new workers who
Right.
could then get a wife and have children on the basis of that new wage. Right.
Right. And the big collapse should have had some effect similar to a forest fire and clearing away some of the old growth, but it didn't. Yeah. So we're stuck with all this, legacy corruption and so we're just accumulating all this debt, not just financial debt, but again, I'm just using a term from the software industry, technical debt. So when a company creates its software, it makes a whole bunch of mistakes along the way and does things wrong, but it's too expensive to go back and fix them, and that's called technical debt. You just have to live with it, and you pay the price in having to fix bugs and work around problems, deal with issues that you could fix, but you can't go back and do it.
You can see the kind of the same thing in the democracies, in the liberal democracies, where they have like slowly started working less well because you have kind of pushed up against the edges of the rules and regulations that you had in place, and those rules and regulations couldn't like predict every possible situation and adjust for it beforehand, and so people have started like abusing those flaws in the system, and so there's a kind of it would be like the kind of the same thing, a technical debt in like the old institutions, and some of them maybe were set up better, so they work a little bit better, but most of them work really badly.
Yeah, you get sort of stuck in a rut where you have all these things are not working great, or they have a lot of issues, but you can't change them because everything is tied to everything else. So you're just sort of stuck with it. Yeah. And anyway, so that was sort of the model I was working off. I don't know if that's the whole story. That's just my very rough model of what's going on. So it seems like a kind of managed decline more than anything else. Like it's just we're not going anywhere. Maybe we're going somewhere on paper. But we don't seem to be going anywhere good in any other sense. I don't see any real progress economically. I see some backsliding in terms of the quality of life.
No, I mean there is a lot of new wealth for new people being created, like for Mark Zuckerberg or what are they called, Brin and Page and all those other guys. But I mean, there's a huge difference between creating Ford and creating Facebook in what it does in a utilitarian for society.
Yeah. Well, I guess also though, I mean, the big successes are in areas that were not previously occupied. Like you find a new niche to occupy, and then you can prosper. But you can't you can't come up with a new automobile company now because the big ones will destroy you. I guess the other thing that didn't happen in the 2010s was peak oil, which is kind of interesting, right? We still seem pretty close to it, and also I think that's an underappreciated part of the 2008 crash or 2007 crash, whatever you want to call it. Energy prices were incredibly high around 2008.
Yeah.
I think it was we were over $100 a barrel oil, and that was
below 30, I think, in the crisis, right? Something like that.
Not in the middle though. I think it was later that it went down.
Okay, maybe a bit later, yeah. And now it's at 60 something. I think.
So now it's still, it's edging up there. It's pretty high, but I'm more of an energy determinist now maybe than I was before, because it seems like the main determining factor in the economy is just the free flow of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Like the more energy we can pump in, like, whether it's communist, capitalist, whatever. If you can, well, obviously, if you're North Korea or Venezuela, then it is the economic system. But if you're not completely retarded, then energy becomes the dominant factor.
In 2010, I guess the shale oil boom had begun
Yeah.
in a small way in the U.S., like the Permian Basin and what's that other one called? Um, it escapes me now. But so that was, I think that was bigger than anyone suspected. So that made a lot of difference.
Yeah, it was
And
that, but also maybe some geopolitical things.
right,
That some like, and I guess that gets into the whole question of what the hell is going on with the U.S. government, who owns it, who's paying for it. Like, uh, I don't know. Saudi Arabia is still the swing producer, isn't it? I mean,
it
you know,
is, and we have actually have a very little clue how large their reserves actually are because
yeah,
you can't trust the stats that they put out on
and
it.
Saudi Arabia and the U.S. seem to be locked together in a very
Right.
close
Yeah.
embrace, and every other major oil producer that could potentially be the swing producer, like Russia and Iran, are the geopolitical enemies of the United States. So anyway, I don't know. It's interesting. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I don't really have any good theories about what's going on there. But whatever the case may be, the powers that be and or technological innovation maintained a pretty stable and fairly low oil price for most of the decade. It does seem to be going up a bit now.
Mm.
But as far as I know, like nothing. I mean, nothing. We haven't done anything about these big issues, right? We haven't done anything about like the whole hope and change. We're going to switch to renewable resources and all that. That has been a bust.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
even if you change all the cars in the world to electric cars, it's still a matter of first of all mining the lithium and so on, and but also how is the electricity produced? If it's still
yeah,
produced with oil and coal, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's just a different ultimate output of how it works, but doesn't matter.
yeah. No. We haven't done anything to get off fossil fuels. Really, we're steadily increasing our use of fossil fuels. In spite of the cult of climate change, which I think is a real concern. I mean, it's obviously a religious belief now,
Mm.
regardless of whether it's true, but I think it is
It
something
is
we
a
should.
it is a concern in the. I mean, you should use the precautionary principle with it.
Right.
But to some extent, you just have to like accept that a certain amount. Um, if um, if it's true that that the effect on the climate is so big from putting out all these fossil fuels in the atmosphere, you're just gonna have to accept that some amount of it, or a pretty large amount of it, maybe, is unavoidable at this point, and that's where the religion of it.
Well, the religion of it
Yeah,
is so divorced from reality
yeah,
that it's just about signaling. I mean, Greta Thunberg is a. We could take like who are the big personalities of the decade thing, and she'd be one of them, just as
yeah.
a symbol of the general insanity of it.
Well,
Uh,
um,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, but since I heard something that made any sense to me, what is the concern?
Well, carbon dioxide affects the heat retention properties of the atmosphere.
But isn't it like this water vapor is like 90% of what the heat
Hmm.
retention is, and then the CO2 is just like whatever
Yeah, it's
1%,
not the most.
5%. So then what is the concern then? I don't get it.
Well, you can look at the history of the Earth and you can see that there were times of, higher and lower carbon dioxide, and that those corresponded to periods of higher and lower temperature, so that's part of it, but also the physics of it is if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, you will increase the overall temperature slightly, which will then increase the amount of water vapor. So water vapor is an amplifier of the effect.
Mm.
And
Right.
the real scare is if there is a big feedback effect from the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? So that's where the big schism is. Is there no feedback effect, or is there some feedback, or is there very large feedback? Yeah.
Well, and also, are there other feedbacks? Are there damping feedbacks, or like is the main?
Yeah.
So I don't think they can predict it. That's what I'll say. I don't think any of these models are going to be accurate. I think there is a valid reason for concern. We are changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. You know,
I agree.
that is a problem, or that could potentially be a big problem. I mean, it could have some positive effects. You know, warming up.
So what is the worst case?
Well, worst case, we all die. I mean,
I guess I thought you would explain to me how we all die.
Okay. Worst case scenario is something like Permian end Permian extinction scenario.
100 years, something, right?
Sorry, what?
4 degrees in 100 years, I think, is a figure I've seen talked about as the worst case.
That's the worst. Then we all die?
No. Here's what the worst case scenario is. The worst case scenario is a runaway process that we tip the Earth system into another state.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so, you know, there was an ice age not too long ago when the Earth system was fairly stable at a very cold temperature. What if, one of the concerns, I don't know how valid it is, but there might be a release of methane from the ocean floors. Like there's a lot of methane stored in the at the bottom of the ocean in something called methane hydrate, or I think that's what it's meant.
If the deep sea ocean warms enough, it could release the methane gas. That's the
that would be like a giant explosion.
No, it would be just a lot of bubbles coming up, but the methane would then further heat things up, which would then cause more of that to be released. And there's similar things about melting permafrost, and
that's a very potent. That's a very potent warmer methane.
Right? Yeah. So the worst case scenario is that some kind of amplifying feedback occurs that pushes us into a completely different world, like a completely different atmosphere, a completely different ocean chemistry. And that has happened before. It happened around the end of the Permian period, probably because of carbon dioxide released from large lava flows in what is now Siberia.
You will have to move to Edmonton if that happens.
So what if
you gotta go further north? The problem, what happened in the Permian, just because now you got me on one of my favorite topics. What happened was oxygen levels plummeted. It seems like the chemistry of the oceans changed, atmosphere changed. Our ancestor, the probable ancestor anyway, was a creature that came down from the high mountains, so it was adapted to low oxygen levels and was able to survive at lower altitudes. So almost all of I think it was 85% of species or something like that died, like just a mass extinction. It was the biggest extinction in history, bigger than the Cretaceous Tertiary event, which was an asteroid hitting the Earth.
Was that the dinosaur one?
The dinosaur one was due to an asteroid.
Extinction was just like almost only very, very small creatures who survived, right? It was only like on the multicellular.
Yeah, they survived by accident, basically.
Wait, are you talking about the which extinction are you talking about?
Permian extinction.
No, well, both of those extinction events, enough things got through. All the major families of life got through. It wasn't like taking things down to single-celled organisms or anything like that. But it was a big extinction event, and the point is, if it had been just a little bit worse, just like if the asteroid that hit at the end of the Cretaceous period had been a little bit bigger, there would be nothing left except maybe bacteria.
I've seen this talking point that this is we are living in the 6th large extinction event now.
We are, yeah. I mean, the anthropogenic extinction. I mean, we'll see how this works out, but it is a big extinction. It is a huge change in the ecosystems of the Earth, but it's not on the scale of those other two.
Right.
Not yet, anyway.
So, is this extinction, does it originate with humans, or have we only exacerbated it and it had already started before us?
The anthropogenic, like the one we're going through now?
Yeah.
Oh no, it's all because of us. Yeah, no, it's
All,
completely
all,
because of us.
all human. Okay, so we can't see like it starting 50 or 100,000 years ago or something, or even longer back.
No, you can see it going around the world, actually. You can see extinctions of large animals everywhere
Oh yeah.
humans show up.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Well, what if the warming of the Earth simply means that then Siberia and wherever you from, the Canada, like just warms up and we can just grow food there. And
Wherever
if
I'm.
a couple of islands
Yeah.
with the big houses on them that the celebrities own go underwater, well, who cares about that? We
Yeah,
can
well, that's the
just
best case
migrate.
scenario. Right. No, that's the best case scenario. The best case scenario is it makes everything better. Yeah.
But I have one more question. The extinction of all those mammoths and everything, isn't some of that related to like the interglacial starting to happen also, or
No,
not?
because like the glacial, I mean, we're still in the, long kind of ice
Yeah,
age period, but those things came and went. Like there were huge glaciations that
yeah.
occurred, melted, recurred, melted, and there were no huge extinction events
Okay, okay.
because animals can move north and south pretty
Yeah.
much. Plants and animals can kind of just, spread north or south, but we have the first big change that humans brought was killing the big animals and burning the landscape. Those were the two
Yeah.
big things.
Right, so it isn't the industrialization,
Well, no, that is
the
part of it.
anthropogenic thing.
The industrialization allowed for more humans to be fed, so we spread out and destroyed the
Yeah.
environment of wild animals at that point. So
Yeah, industrialization allowed for a lot more things, but just the general. I mean, the human way of life is a completely new way of life. Uh, like no living being has ever lived as we do. No living being has ever used technology in a large way. Like some animals use rocks or sticks to do things, but no animal has built complex technology. No animal has created large scale societies. So
but you can
and
see
no,
that how many humans were there? 1 billion before industrialization, or was it even less than that?
um, yeah, planet wide. Well, I mean, industrialization is difficult to define, right? Because
Yeah,
the,
before the 1800 or something like
before
that.
the 1800s,
Yeah.
I don't know what the global population was. Probably around a billion. Yeah. Let me just look this up. The world population has, of course, increased a lot in the last century, but let me just get the actual numbers. I hope to have a nice little chart on Wikipedia here. It says about 2 billion in 1900, and it looks like about 1 billion around 1800, but I'm trying to find a good chart here. Okay, Wikipedia doesn't have a good chart. I have this chart somewhere, but yeah, I mean, we're up to about 8 billion now, right? So we're about 4 times the size that we were at the beginning of the century. Sorry, at 1900. And
And all indications is we're gonna top 10 billion at some point. So pretty soon.
yeah, there's no chance of it slowing down. Okay, this is a better chart. Let me just pull this one. Have you gone to the Max Roser site, the Our World in Data?
No, I haven't.
Oh, really? It's pretty good. It has a lot of good charts and statistics and things. All right, so it says about a billion in 1800. It says 1.65 billion in 1900. So yeah, it goes up so it basically doubled from 1800 to 1900, and then in the year 2000 it was at 6 billion, so it multiplied by 3, a little more than 3 in that 100-year period, and now we're already up to about 8 billion, in spite of collapsing fertility. But the real pre-industrial population,
the collapsing fertility hasn't had enough time to have much effect yet on the.
it's had a big effect in the rate of growth. Like if you think about, say,
Of course, yeah.
I mean, imagine if the U.S. population had
Oh yeah.
fertility
If it was 3, or something.
or if China's population
Right.
had maintained their historical fertility after the communist revolution. Like, what if they had,
Yeah.
they would have multiplied by 6.
Absolutely. I was thinking that it hasn't had enough time to shrink any populations yet.
But
because,
okay, so let's say that
because
would
of
have happened.
longevity.
Let's say that would have happened. How would that have affected the warming of the Earth
What happened?
if Chinese didn't have their whatever one-child policy or whatever? Like if they just kept growing. And there were I don't know how many instead of 2 billion, I don't know how many Chinese there are. If instead of 1.5 billion there would be like 5 billion Chinese, how would that affect the
If they didn't have the one-child
climate?
policy or like policies to that effect, they probably wouldn't have industrialized as fast as they did. So maybe their output wouldn't be as large even if the population was bigger.
Yeah.
At this
Well,
point.
the problem with these, well, hold on. The problem with these counterfactual, hypothetical thought experiments is that you can't hold everything else constant and change one
Exactly.
thing. If they had gone to 5 billion and not industrialized, they would probably have started starving to death.
Yeah.
Long before.
Well, if Africa were growing at the rate that it is now, but it was contained, like we wouldn't allow them to move to other places, how would that affect the global climate?
Would you mean stop sending like foreign aid to Africa?
Yeah, just whatever, build a wall around Africa.
They would starve.
Yeah, they would starve. But see, I'm trying to understand what is anthropogenic about this climate change, and I was up to this point I was thinking, well, it must have been the setting free of the fossil fuels, like releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere that was contained in the Earth. But now you're saying, like, now you're saying that isn't.
We need to do a separate. We're gonna have to do.
Yeah,
we're gonna have to do.
Well, you can cut all this out anyway.
We need to have the flat Earth debate and the climate change debate.
This has nothing to do with the 2010s. I mean, obviously.
Yeah.
But,
well, I don't know. It's an issue.
You can look at this. I mean, in the abstract way, you can just look at this as every human has like an average emission of CO2, right? So if the amount of humans increase, the total amount of CO2 will emit.
Well, no, but I don't see that because they have to consume to produce.
It's all based on fossil fuels. Yes, it's all 100% about the amount of fossil fuels we're pulling out of the ground. Well, a little more complicated than that because you can do things like burn forests or let them grow back, and that will change the amount of carbon that is stored in forests. So human activity changes the atmosphere by changing the biosphere or by pulling carbon out of the lithosphere. That's the basic thing, right? And industrialization added this process by which we pull carbon out of the lithosphere, out of the ground, out of the rocks, and put it into the air, right? Now, that carbon does get pulled back into the biosphere, and some of it goes back to the lithosphere. There are these big cycles that go on the Earth of there's this carbonate rock cycle that takes millions and millions of years for rocks to weather, pull carbon dioxide out of the air, store it in limestone, then it gets pulled down into the earth, melts, gets released in volcanoes, and so on and so forth. So there are natural cycles, and then there's the human effect on the biosphere, and then there's the dumping of carbon from fossil fuels. The big factor is the dumping of carbon from fossil fuels. That's what's changing the atmosphere the most right now.
Okay.
Anyways,
so that's a big one.
So it could be, I mean, it could produce a paradise. I mean, it could melt Greenland and Antarctica, and then we can all go and.
I guess I don't have the percentages on this, but livestock too, right? Emissions of methane gas from livestock is a pretty big contributor.
Well, they say that, but I mean, I don't know. Methane is a greenhouse gas. So I don't know, though, if putting cows on the landscape is increasing the amount of methane that is being produced. Maybe, I don't know. Like methane is produced by lots of biological processes. So one fermentation, cows use fermentation to break down cellulose, right? Not all herbivores do that, but a lot of them do that. They use bacteria to break it down. But that doesn't mean that something else wouldn't have done the same thing to break it down. And methane, I don't know what its half-life is in the atmosphere, but it...
So you're saying the total amount is not increased necessarily because the energy system is a closed system kind of with a...
Yeah, it's not adding anything net new, but it might be changing the chemical composition because it's changing the processes. Like if you're putting more cellulose through a cow's gut, then you're putting in something else, then it might produce more methane in the short term, even though that methane would be part of a natural cycle. I don't know. Anyway, this is pretty tangential stuff. So let's save it for another time. But it's just one of those things that it's an issue that's come up and it's become, and this is actually something I wanted to talk about, the increasing religiosity of truth.
Oh yeah.
That seems to be a trend. That before there was this kind of separation between religious and moral issues, and it wasn't perfect, but there was this fairly good separation there.
It was put kind of in a corner of society, kind of.
Well, it just seems like more things have been shifted into the morals or religious
As the church has died, well, this is the thesis of conservatives, actually, really. As the church has died, the religion has moved back into like secular society and taken new shapes. I think that's a pretty good hypothesis. But,
no, I totally agree, and I think like we've seen the rise of a new religion, and this religion is a crypto religion, so it gets away. It doesn't have the separation between church and state, or that tacit agreement. We're going to keep religion out of all these things.
It's the opposite.
Well, it's crept into science, so now science and the academy, the media, all these things have become quasi-religious institutions.
But it's kind of hilarious how insidious it is, because Greta Thunberg, what she says is like, listen to the scientists.
Well, exactly. I mean,
what that means is not listen to the scientists. What that means is believe.
Right. You have to believe this, and if a scientist says something else, then they're not a scientist. It's
right.
Yeah, well, that is what I mean.
It's kind of fun how it's evolved into, because it's genius, actually.
Well, I don't know if it's genius. I don't even know if it's conscious, but I just mean that it's the opposite of the.
It's fascinating how good it is at cloaking itself in the language of like the secular institution of the university and so on, which was formerly kind of in opposition to.
Right, but just like the segregation of church and state was kind of a neat idea, right? You're not supposed to bring your personal wishful thinkings and delusions to the political arena, like keep your beliefs to yourself and whatever, go to church and do the stuff over there. But now this stuff is not only separated, but it's integral to politics. Like, who does she talk to? She's talking to all of the top world leaders of all of the nation states. She's saying, "How dare you?" and shit like that. And this is a religion that is now determining political action.
Yeah, it is, and it is interesting how it has just taken over, like how Gilmour was saying that. Well, it is a new kind of religion, right? And so any religion, I guess, would want to occupy all the distribution channels for culture, right? It would want to take over the culture to propagate. And yeah, it has not done that entirely because the internet exists, but it has taken over a lot of them.
By the way, do you remember that I talked about Greta like a long time ago when she was big in here in Sweden, and I said she will come to your country soon. Do you remember this?
I don't remember the prediction. When did you make it?
It had been going on here by then for like 2 or 3 or 4 months or something. And I said, I think I wrote in the chat, and I said like, wait till she comes for you or something. Or this has been going on for a long time here.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it was we first noticed her, and then you said, oh yeah, she's already.
Oh, that may yeah.
Or she was a meme, and you're like, oh yeah, she's been big here for years or something like that. Yeah.
What is she actually doing?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Emoting in front of the UN or whatever.
No, I understand that, but like, what is the consequence? Like, why is she? I believe you started out by saying that she was one of the most important like VIPs of this decade, right?
Well, a symbol.
Well, okay, a symbol, but what has she actually done? Like, what is the consequence of her activism?
She's a meme. I mean, all of the big symbols of the decade are people who became memes.
I mean, she's not had much of a consequence, like policy-wise, at least not yet. Maybe she will have. But the big thing that she has done is like split up people in two camps for or against her, basically. Like any good religious figure. I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I understand that like people are now divided into pro-Greta and anti-Greta, like pro-environmentalism, anti-environmentalism, blah blah. But it's like I don't want to call it environmentalism because environmentalism might actually be something sensible, but it's not. Like nobody discusses this.
It's not environmentalism in like.
It's a religion. It's like a cult. It's not. Let's
like
talk rationally about our Earth or whatever. Let's.
She's a preacher, you know.
Yeah.
She's a preacher, and she's like
cult of Gaia or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something we've seen a lot of lately. The worshiping of the child's perspective kind of thing. Like the children can see the truth. You know,
David Hogg.
Children haven't had a chance to be corrupted by patriarchy and systemic racism and all that. I don't know. I don't want to get too much into Greta specifically. I just think she's a symbol of that, the irrationality of the decade and the increasing irrationality of our societies, that they can't deal with reality, so they just degenerates into this game, this sort of signaling fest, right? It's just, everything is turning into this big ideological RPG.
I think this also, because she could never have been a boy. I think it also ties into your point.
I don't know about that.
The feminization of because a young, very childlike looking girl has much more of an innocence kind of aura around her than a boy of 16 years would have. I think. Maybe a much younger boy maybe could have the same effect, possibly, but
maybe you're right, but I don't think there was much of an emphasis on her gender or sex.
No,
it's the mimetic power of it. It's not. Yeah. It's not whether people talked about it. It's just that because she was a girl, she worked as a meme more than a boy would.
Maybe, right. But I think they would have played it up more if that was one of the if there was a focal point of her persona, then I think they would have played it up more. I think if anything, it's more her autism or whatever she has, like her condition, her mental condition is helped her much more than her being a girl.
Yeah, well, that's another thing she represents, the growing autism.
Yeah,
that's true. But could you have seen an autistic boy?
No.
I mean, autistic boys are
More common.
No, they're serial killers.
More common, right. And very looked down upon in general, even if you're not outright with it.
Maybe you're right that her being female has helped her.
All right, well, we can let that one.
Yeah.
So let that one remain undetermined.
Okay. No.
Yeah, so I gotta wrap this up because I gotta get going. But I don't know. How do you sum it up now that we've gone through? It seems like it's very open-ended and rambly, and well, actually, predictions for the future. Like, I think we've gone through a period of increasing cognitive dissonance, a sort of amplification and acceleration of things, and we have not solved anything. We have issues in front of us, but we're not actually dealing with them.
Well,
and
okay, go ahead.
And I'm just going to give my very brief prediction for the next decade that it's going to be a decade of chaos, because I think we've demonstrated that we don't have the ability to solve the problems that we're facing. So the problems are going to get increasingly obvious, and yet then people are going to try to deny them even more strongly. Some people will want to deal with them in one way or another, but none of the ways they want to deal with them will be the actual right way to deal with them. So, I mean, it's not a very good prediction. It's pretty vague and wishy-washy. I'm just saying we're going into chaos. Immanentizing the abyss is my prediction. That, we started out the decade with very whimsical and a cheerful attitude, it seems, like a sort of vague optimism, and people were having fun on the internet and stuff, and it ended with this civil war that's not a shooting war yet, but it ended in this chaos and fragmentation and conflict and just general confusion. And I don't know, I guess I'm very pessimistic. I'm ending this decade very pessimistically. Like, things don't look good to me. I don't see any great reason for hope about the future, given that, just given where we are and where we seem to be going, that we haven't done a damn thing about any of the big problems facing humanity. We have no institutions that can give us guidance. We can't trust the media, the government, any of those institutions, the academy. But we can't trust the general public to come up with good ideas either. So, yeah, very black. Okay, black. We've gone from red pill to black pill. That's my simple summary. There you go.
It's the best pill. Black pill is the best pill. Well, so anyway, so let me just say a couple things. Basically, I agree with you. I think that the internet has set us free in a way, but that also at the same time means that there isn't a cohesive, there isn't anything cohesive you can turn to. Everybody is just kind of scattered around like cockroaches, right? Everybody's like, I'm gonna be NRX, I'm gonna be alt-right, I'm gonna be a communist, I'm gonna be a neo-Marxist, whatever. So the positive thing you could say is the establishment lost its control. So it's not like 1984 where you have to follow suit. There isn't like a big brother that is telling you what to think. But the negative thing that this brought about is just that everybody's just scattered around, like scatterbrained. Even if somebody like you has a solution, you only have like 30 people in your Discord.
Keep rubbing it in, yeah.
Yeah. No, oh fuck! I had a joke, but I forgot it now.
It's all right.
I wanted to end it on a joke, but anyway, I forgot it. But I guess Amendum was right all along.
Oh. Yeah, so you're ending it as an F-list. Yeah, well, we did get this liberation, but like all the liberations, it doesn't produce utopia. Right? It did not produce greater rationality. It did allow for dissent, but a lot of the dissent is just crazy. So it's not producing a coherent response, right? Yeah. We don't have a coherent, rational movement to form a new establishment that could actually steer the Titanic, so we remain captain. We remain with the same captain as before. Only the captain's even drunker now than he was.
And there is also mutiny going on the Titanic now.
Yeah, I think the reactionary forces or the populist forces or whatever, they will increase in power for some time yet. I think at least a couple of years more. And well, I'm just about as black-pilled as you are on actual change, or I'm not even sure if they possess the means to change anything. But I think the opinions will keep shifting right wing for a good while yet. But it could be way too late, and I don't know if that's a solution anyway. Even if they could implement some policies which change things a bit for the better, but yeah.
Okay, so I guess we ended on the black pill. Next decade will be the black pill decade. Yeah.
Pessimism is rational. That was my Inmendum impersonation. But anyway, I don't know. So
that was your Inmendum impersonation?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're just a fucking idiot, Dan.
Yeah, come on. It's just fucking.
No, I mean I could, but I could do better. But there was just one particular moment that I remembered where he was like, "Pessimism is irrational." Well, anyway, so okay. Yeah, let's hope we are still around to do a recap of the 2020s, right?
Yeah, that'll be interesting if we make it.
Let's get for 12th of January 2030.
Right, let's schedule it in advance.
All right.
10 a.m. Pacific.
And we'll get Kudzu to join us.
Yeah. He'll be an adult by that.
I know. Yeah.
He'll be a big boy.
All right, talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.